everyone, I'm Michelle Royer. I'm Head of Community Services at the Lucy Robbins Wells Library. I am here tonight with Yvonne Alston and all of you on our panel tonight to have some wonderful conversations and an amazing presentation. So I just wanted to ask everyone when the presentation starts, if you can put yourself into mute because we will be recording this program. It will be on the library website as well as the Newington Chamber of Commerce website, and anyone else that is interested will be able to do that. So what we're going to do now is we are going to talk about the name of the program, which is the Foundations in Diversity. And we have tonight with us Yvonne Alston, and she is from Indelible Impressions. And we are going to talk about conversations, and hopefully we'll all learn something from each other tonight. This is going to be a beginning of a series. So the next program that we're going to be doing is Bravery to Safe Spaces, and Yvonne will be talking about that in just a few moments. And then our next program we'll be doing, that will be in October, will be Hidden Figures to the Forefront, and that will be on October 6th. And again, she'll give us a little information about what that is. So for right now, I just want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and we're going to get started. And I just wanted to say we met Yvonne a few short months ago at a women's networking meeting at the Newington Chamber of Commerce. And all of us were just in awe. We just couldn't stop talking. I think it's the longest women's networking meeting we ever had. And so, shortly into the phone call, it was, Yvonne, do you want to do a program with the Chamber in the library? And here we are. So as I was on her website and as I've been getting to know her and have conversations, we talked about what we wanted these programs to be. And I'm just going to start with a quote of what she said on her website that really just sticks out to me. And I think it's going to be the bulk of what we talk about tonight. So here's her quote. Yvonne says, "We are at our best when all of our voices are heard and valued, and when everyone has the opportunity to contribute their diverse perspectives and talents to the mission at hand. That is when we think broader, do better, and achieve greater." And the only other thing I'm going to do before we start is I'm going to give you a little information about Yvonne, and I'm sure she is going to tell us so much more. So, Yvonne Alston is a DEI strategist, communicator, and a marketer. Launched her firm, Indelible Impressions Consulting. What makes Yvonne a unique and strong DEI partner is her 21 years in strategy, delivering the right message, and executing help to organizations achieve their goals. She strongly believes being inclusive and creating a culture of belonging brings out the best in individuals, boosts innovation, and productively increases team cohesion, and ultimately strengthens the organization's workforce and bottom line. And Yvonne, just tell us so much more. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you to the Newington Chamber of Commerce and the Lucy Wells Library as well for hosting this discussion. I'm super excited and honored to be with all of you tonight. As Michelle mentioned, I'm a DEI strategist based here in Newington, Connecticut. I have a true love, passion, and purpose when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion for organizations, whether those are for-profit, nonprofit, and municipalities, just really helping them to understand a little bit more about their culture, where they can grow, if you will, in their culture, and helping them to get there. So again, super excited about this discussion tonight. I did originally have a poll that I was going to run, but it looks like we don't have those capabilities on this particular Zoom platform tonight. But I figure I'm gonna open it up with a question anyways. So the question tonight, just to kick things off, is: are you satisfied with the social treatment that minorities receive in contemporary American society? And I'm going to give you three options for answers. And if you could drop those into the chat, that would be awesome. So the first answer is A, yes. Although serious discrimination does still exist, I feel that we are slowly moving towards a more equal and fair society. Answer B is not really. Racial resentment, prejudice, and institutional discrimination still characterize life in America for those who identify as Black. Or C, not at all. Race relations are beginning to worsen, and I feel that it's important for our community to be unified, self sufficient, and resolute in these troubling times. So you have your options of A, B, or C. Please drop your answers into the chat and I will tally. So far I've got a C, E, B. All right. Right. Another one. One, two. Make sure I got them all. One, two, three, four, five, six. All right. So, okay, and another one, B. All right. So, to the question, are you satisfied with the social treatment that minorities generally receive in contemporary American society? A majority of you answered B, not really. Racial resentment, prejudice, and institutional discrimination still characterize life in America for those who identify as Black. And so, yes, I think that certainly that's an issue. There is certainly right now in our communities and society overall a lot of racial resentment, prejudice, and institutional discrimination. This has a lot to do with how our country was built, colonialism in particular. And there is a lot of work to be done, which is part and parcel as to why we're having this conversation tonight. So I'd like for us, before we start to open it up, to have more of a dialogue. I wanted to just share some information with you, a couple of statistics, get the ball rolling of talking about generations and the subject of race and racial discrimination, because it's something that, as we know, you turn on any news station, you open up any paper, whether digitally or physically, and it seems like only almost daily now there are discussions around race relations as it relates certainly to politics, to health disparities when it comes to policing in our country as well. So again, lots of conversation about this. And when it comes to different generations, it's really important that we be thoughtful about how we engage in these dialogues. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay. Right. Please let me know when you can see my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, excellent. So, generational misconceptions, right? I like to start off with this quote from James Baldwin because I feel like it's really important. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And the reason why that quote I feel like resonates so well with this moment in time as it did when he was quoted saying it is because we are at this precipice where culture is changing. The literal makeup of society is changing tremendously. And we need to be able to move forward with those times. And as I noted earlier, it's really important that we think about different generations as we embark on these conversations. I From my recollection, when we all talked on the chamber call that Michelle pointed out earlier, it was very interesting as we got into this dialogue about different generations and how they think and how they feel about dynamics that are going on in our culture. And oftentimes, when we embark on those conversations, it can be, confrontational. There can be a lot of tension there around that. And so it's really important to be thoughtful about how we can really just overcome that, right? And so part of the discussion that I often hear is, I just don't understand how they think. Why do they do this? Can you please help me understand X? And what we see is that each generation approaches a conversation about race differently. I would say that baby boomers who have lived through the civil rights era, for example, of the 1960s, they really do see race and Gen Xers from a very different lens, right? And we know that for Gen Xers, much of society was desegregated, but also still very disconnected and not really having that equality of experience that was promised by our forefathers. And despite the best efforts of those in the civil rights era, we're still seeing a lot of divisions among races. We see this dynamic play out certainly in socioeconomic arenas, in health disparities, when it comes to equal pay. It was just recently, I believe it was last week, last Wednesday, I want to say, was Black Women's Equal Pay Day, highlighting the importance and the wealth disparities that exist within our country because of unequal pay. And so, we're having these conversations. People are posting on social media about it, but it's really tough to think about how do we approach these dialogues, whether that's with our families, whether that's with our friends, or even our colleagues, because it can be very sensitive. It can be very polarizing, and oftentimes people can walk away either confused, frustrated, or with hurt feelings. So, part of the goal tonight is to have an honest, open, brave, courageous community conversation about how we start those conversations. What are the core tenets for how to engage in good conversation, and something that I think we can walk away with some tangibles, hopefully, of how to engage with those better, not just for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our families, but even more so, I would say, for society. And so when we think about, let me just make sure I can click through. Yep. When we think about how we feel about different generations, it usually brings up a lot of different ideas. We hear a lot of talk definitely about millennials, right? Living in this digital age where everything pretty much gets posted online. There are a lot of conversations happening on platforms like Instagram and TikTok as it relates to this. And a lot of times, those conversations, when it comes from generation to generation, we bring our preconceived notions into that perspective. We bring that into conversations. And so it puts topics like race really front and center. And then a lot of times that can sometimes go into politics as well. And we know based on the last couple of years in politics and what has gone on in Washington, that mixing both race and politics together, as I often say, is like throwing lighter fluid, squirting lighter fluid on an already burning house, right? It just inflames. And so, again, we really need to be thoughtful about the generations in which we're engaging with and what they think, and also what we think about them. And that's why there are some self reflection questions up on your screen. So, are your feelings generally positive or negative about different generations? Do you automatically make these assumptions or generalizations about them? Like, for example, millennials, right? There's a lot of flack that millennials get that they're whiny and they want everything their way. They are actually very much at the forefront right now of pushing conversations for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in community and in businesses. But oftentimes they get a bad rap, if you will. And the other question being, do you consider their experiences among your own? Do you really think about the people that you're engaging with? What was important to them as they were growing up, perhaps what they lived through, what that lived experience was like for them, and certainly how that colors their perception of race. And so with that, I just want to engage Chris a little bit to get his perspective because I know he's doing a lot of fantastic work in the West Hartford Chamber. And so I'd like to, Chris, if you wouldn't mind unmuting, and forgive me if I look between screens because I've got two going on here. um, in terms of what your thoughts are, what your experiences have been in terms of having these conversations around generations and racial dialogues.
So, it's a lot to take in, right? And
Yeah.
I will say, from my perspective in particular, I work with tons of millennials, and I'm raising three, young ladies who are part of Gen Z.
Mm,
And I will say, that I quote my dad on this a lot, and I feel this is applicable not just based on age, but lived experience and communities of origin. No matter how dirty, warped, or cracked your lens is, it shapes your view for the universe. Right? My dad always used to
yeah.
say this as a kid. Bias of being a photographer, I guess. But one thing that I will say, for whatever our impressions are about millennials and Gen Z, about their feelings of entitlement, or their desire to see things done in their way. If you really pull back from that, baby boomers said the same thing about us in Gen X, right?
Absolutely.
We have this really weird way of looking at the world, and we want things to go our way. And traditionalists, or the greatest generation, as they were called in their time, said the same thing about baby boomers. When they were out there protesting the war, and fighting for civil rights, beginning the civil rights movement. So I think firstly it's a matter of perspective, and I think secondly, one of the things I really appreciate about millennials and Gen Z is, as we say in Brooklyn, they're here for their smoke. Like they will have these uncomfortable conversations. They have no qualms about saying, you know what,
Yes.
I don't think that's right, and here's why I
Yeah.
don't think that's right. And to some degree, from my lens, sometimes the pendulum swings a little too far one way,
Yep.
and sometimes in the quest you know to see right done,
Mm,
there's an elimination of the conversation process,
yes.
or there's a lack of tolerance for bringing people along. It's like, this is what it is, and if you're not on board, then you get left behind, kind of situation. um
Right.
but I appreciate the energy. I
Yeah.
absolutely appreciate their energy.
And there's, it's interesting that you say that because much like you, I have a Gen Zer, I have a daughter, and, having those conversations, they have a zeal and a tenacity about them and intentionality about the conversations and about moving that forward. But I think some of the challenges are, and I find this, and I'm sure other people on this Zoom do as well, is when we have the older generations, they don't necessarily agree with some of the perspectives. They don't necessarily always agree with noting different lived experiences. And we find that across racial lines oftentimes, right? And this is where the discussion can often go into the dynamic of gaslighting, right? Which is basically saying that, I don't know, I haven't experienced that thing, and I don't think that it's real. That oftentimes comes into conversations around, I think, institutional racism, or what we call systemic racism in our country. And so when people don't experience those things for themselves, it's very easy to indicate to others who have experienced it, who are explaining their experience, to say, well, oh, no, 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 I don't think that that's a real thing, or I've never seen that occur. And it's almost devaluing the individual's experience and basically acting like it can't happen, it didn't happen. And so that can be incredibly frustrating for those who are on the receiving end of some of those racial dynamics. So when we think about how we got to this point, and I did a little bit of research because I wanted to make sure to provide you a little bit more context around that. And driving the generational gap in perspective to race has really been long fraught. There was a diversity explosion, if you will, that happened in 2011 when, for the first time in the history of our country, more minority babies than white babies were born in 2011. And very quickly, as a result of that, most children in the US now, as a result, will be part of some ethnic minority group, primarily Hispanics, Blacks, Asians, and other non-white races. And so in about 3 decades, as we know, whites will actually constitute a minority of the population. And as you can imagine, this doesn't make everyone happy. There are concerns and conversations that are happening throughout communities about why is this really just based on colonialism? Are they unhappy about this because it's about power? What will that mean for our country? Will there even be a dynamic of reverse slavery? And people actually, and that might be shocking to some, but people are actually having these conversations. And these are all really good questions with many perspectives and answers. But what we know to be as a fact at this point, and based on data of what will become the new minorities, is particularly Hispanic and Asians will become an increasingly strong thread in America's new fabric of society, if you will. And so when we get into talking about that amongst different generations, people get uncomfortable. This is not something that people are oftentimes used to discussing. And so what we often find is what happens around the dinner table, right? Especially in holidays. I got this clip. It's really funny. It was a Hello Thanksgiving Miracle video. You can link out to it, look at it on YouTube or out in what my stepmom refers to as the Google machine, about having these conversations around the dinner table with people who come from different generations and have carried forth a perspective at that time from their time about this, what they're willing to discuss, how open or potentially how closed their mind may be to embracing different ideologies, different topics, especially when it comes to equality, when it comes to equity of opportunities. When we think about this in the workplace in particular, there is oftentimes this challenge around uh, Black people or minorities kind of picking themselves up by their bootstraps, right? In terms of wanting more equity, wanting access to opportunities that they have not had access to before. And Chris, I don't know, or anybody else can feel free to kind of chime in on this in terms of why that perspective occurs, how we can have those conversations and challenge some of that thinking in a very productive way, not to be confrontational, but to help people to understand, at least from a society and historical context, as to why the bootstrap, for example, aspect isn't really valid. And I don't know if
I,
anybody wants to chime in on that.
I'll chime in right away, right? Because
Yes.
I think about the minority business network that we created in West Hartford. You know, myself and Stephen King Jr., who's on the line as well, founding members. You know, and it started based on a conversation that Stephen and I had. You know, we're both active members of our communities. We're both business people who were doing business in West Hartford, and you know, the minority business network was created in order to create opportunities and to spotlight people of color who were doing business in the greater Hartford area.
Yep.
And some people go, well, why do you need that? You know, everybody has the same opportunities. Everybody, you know, is doing the same thing. Everybody's coming into the room, you know, with the same, the same opportunity being granted to them. And I often say you cannot ask for access to a room if you don't know that the damn building exists, right? And when I think about what really started the Minority Business Network, it's the fact that, giving an example, we would do spotlight conversations as part of our chamber meeting. So one chamber member would have the opportunity to spotlight their business, and instead of doing the regular 30-second commercial that we would all have the opportunity to do, they would have the chance to do a 5-minute presentation. And during one such presentation, we had a local realtor who did a video, and it was an amazing video. It was very well done. It was done in good taste, and it showcased him as the realtor. And he, in the video, which was filmed by another chamber member and written by that chamber member, or at least helped scripted, it showcased how this realtor brings to bear his network to benefit his clients. And so he showed, the attorney who helps with closing. He showed the insurance agent who helps you get a policy for your home. He showed the landscaper who helps to clean up around the house and clean up the yard and so forth. And as the video is going on, someone leaned over to me and goes, "You think they know any Black people?" All right. And I turned to him and said, "You think they know any women?" He said, "Wow, I didn't think of that." And I said, "Neither did they." And it wasn't a malicious thing. It wasn't an ill-intended thing. But the reality is, people do business with people they like, and people make them feel comfortable. And I talk about three things that are at the core of most human problems, from my observation, right? Leftover primitive behaviors that have kept us alive. We're tribal, so we seek out safety in numbers. We seek out people we have a commonality with, and there's a belief that those people will keep us safe. We're insular, so once we have that tribe, we go, "I don't want to be bothered by the outside. Just let me do my thing and leave me alone." And then we're apathetic. So if it's not directly happening to our tribe, it's very hard for us to care, because realistically, there's so much going on the planet. You can't care about everything, right? And so bringing that back to the Minority Business Network, it was created for that exact reason, because it wasn't a malicious thing. It wasn't an exclusionary thing. It was just by nature, people tend to gravitate towards people like that. And so in that video, it was a bunch of white males. And these are all guys that I've had conversations with. These are all guys I've had drinks with. They like me just fine. But when it came time to do business, they thought about their buddies, and their buddies are the guys who grew up like them, had the same values as them, and had the same lived experiences as them. And so when people go, "Oh, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps," I'm standing out here shoeless, bro. Like, my, even when we talk about the idea of privilege isn't necessarily a group of things or benefits that you've gotten or that you have that puts you in a much better place. Sometimes it's an absence of detriments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a big conversation to be had about privilege. And I definitely want to get into that. First of all, thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important. It's very eye-opening when we think about what we commonly refer to in the DEI space as affinity bias, right? And it's that natural gravitation to what looks and feels like us, what is easy for us, what we're drawn to. And so we just by nature, as Chris pointed out, we lead towards that, and we don't always think about how much diversity is around us and what are the benefits of diversity to us. So before I get into a little bit more on that, Jill, you have your hand up if you want to come off mute and ask the question.
I can find my mute button. Feels like it moves around on every screen. I just, it's interesting, the individuals that are on the call, in particular, Chris, because Chris and I feel like we have so much more to talk about, Chris, but our lives just keep circling back to conversations about diversity. But it's like, there's a lot of other stuff Chris and I want to talk about, but we love each other and we feel like we trust each other, which is, or at least I love him. I don't know how he feels about me, but
No, I love you. Stop playing.
So here's the thing so I have been for the past, let's say now year, really trying to work on me. And I'm grateful for individuals like Chris, Stephen, who I'm getting to know, I don't know as well as Chris, definitely Jasmine, who I feel I can trust, who are my friends that I like to say have brown skin and can school me, but are not here to teach me. And so what I mean by that is it's not someone that isn't white's responsibility to teach those of us who are white the ways of being black or the ways of being brown, right? We have to do. And then if we have those people we trust, like I do, we can check in. And so I think that's something for me that's been very powerful. And accepting and being okay saying the words that I am a racist, not active, not intentionally, but overtly and systematically. And I am working on becoming anti-racist, but it's a process. It doesn't mean that I don't love others. It just means that some of the systematic stuff has gotten into my life because I benefit from my color. And I think for me, most recently, my neighbor, I have a couple. One gentleman is black and his husband is Puerto Rican. And my Puerto Rican friend was over. We were discussing this topic, and he was discussing this. I'm in Springfield. There's a Healing Racism Institute, and he was sharing with me that at this course, they really come out of the gate and like pound you with like messages that are really hard and really difficult. And I said, oh, I wouldn't like that. Oh, I would become defensive and that would not be my style. And he went, must be nice. And I went, huh? And he said, well, it must be nice to be able to pick and choose when you want to deal with things and when you don't. When I walk into a room, I'm always Puerto Rican.
Wow.
And that kind of smack from someone that you love, like Chris has had to smack me and that's been good. I'm waiting for Stephen King to smack me, but now he's a politician, so he would get in trouble if he, so anyway, I'm just kidding. But, but it's realizing that. And I think further than that and beyond just race, when you look at diversity, inclusion, and belonging, it's about the responsibility. I've been dealing with this with the West Hartford Chamber and Jesse. It's the responsibility that each of us has to remember that someone else is looking, whether we realize it or not, that someone else is looking at us and looking at our behavior. And even though I'm a smart ass, and even though I say things privately to Chris that we might have our little shtick, that if I say that publicly, somebody's going to observe that and think that that's okay behavior. Like we've used the example of if you're in a networking setting and you're a businesswoman and you automatically allow a man to hug you, you are setting up the younger generation to think it's okay to not have permission to hug each other. And so that's like a far out example that kind of goes off of race, but I think it's that message that we as each single individual, irregardless of color, sexual orientation, age, etc., have to remember that someone is watching and how we live in the world, because I live like a smartass and I realized along the way that I've hurt people and I've had to go back and make those amends. So I know that was really long-winded. I actually am paying attention. So I just wanted to share all that and love you.
No, I think that that's really beautiful. I'm actually really happy that you brought up the dynamic of self-education because you're right. That is very important that we take ownership on an individual basis and that we're not putting other people, whether they're Black, whether they're Indigenous peoples, whether they're Hispanic or Asian or whatever, South Asian, not putting them in the position to teach me about your race, but more so taking the time to learn for oneself. And then when you don't understand something fully, come and ask the questions, right? And making sure that there's mutual respect so that there's a safe space in which you can do so. I know that for this group, myself, Michelle, Tiffany, Leslie, we had a lovely conversation a couple weeks ago, and we talked about the premise of saying, I don't see color and what that really meant. And so this is something that generationally, again, people said as a way to show actually their support for people of color, to say like, I'm kind of agnostic, right? This is their way of saying like, I don't discern different people by that. I'm looking at them through the content of their character and not their skin color. But as I explained to the group, that when we say that, it really is saying, I don't see you, because part of me and who I am and my personal identity is part of my race. It is not all of me. Certainly, there's intersectionality in my existence, but that is part of me. And so to say that you don't see that really does denote to people of color, I don't see the struggles that you go through. I don't see the inequity and inequality that exists in your life and that you're subject to. I don't see and understand or acknowledge what that experience is like and how that hinders you in various ways and in various forms of life. So we got to move kind of that language, and that's part of what I've been talking about too with a lot of clients in different groups, is the dynamic of relanguaging and how important that is. That the things that we used to say a couple generations ago were fine, but now we're moving forward, right? We're moving the culture and society forward. So we need to be more thoughtful and more mindful about the things that we say and how that can be received.
You know,
And so with that, go ahead, Chris.
no, I was just going to say it's one of those situations where, you know, it's well-intentioned racism, right? Like, you know, it's an interesting thing when you do the dissection of the, you know, I don't see you as, or, you know, I don't see color, because it's, you know, it's not something that somebody generally says in a malicious way. They're trying
No.
to, you know, I see you as an equal. I see all people as equal. You know, I don't take a biased lens based on race. And you know, when having the conversation about being racist or committing a racist act, I realized that in my conversations with my white friends, the word racist is almost as triggering as dropping the N-bomb to a black person, right? Like, it's like, oh my God, no, I'm not racist. I couldn't possibly be racist, and here's why, right? And it's like, no. Racism isn't, you know, racist isn't necessarily a I won't say it's not a negative thing, but calling someone a racist, as triggering as it may be, right? You have to learn to treat being a racist in the same way as, you know, when you have a kid and that kid commits some sort of bad action, right? You separate the person from the action.
Well, and Chris, I think to that point, and that's, you know, when my neighbor and I had this discussion and he used the word racist to speak of me, I was like floored. Like, I can't think of a better word. Like, I mean, you know me and you know my background and my story. And I was like, da, da, da. But then I was like, wait a second. I am, because I accept benefit from a system that's broken, even though I might not be. And I think that that's the difference, is if you call somebody racist, like you're racist, that is like potentially using the N-word, although I don't necessarily think as offensive, but still harmful.
No, not as offensive, but
right. But I think there's a difference between saying that somebody is overtly racist and saying someone is systematically or institutionally racist. I definitely have learned that I am racist. I am not actively, I am trying to become actively non-racist, but it's a process. I have to unlearn a lot of behaviors that have just been put into my deep psyche somewhere. And so I do think, Chris, that there is, it definitely is a trigger, but it's not it's a good thing when the person you're talking to can be open to it, because
that's if you're open to having the conversation, right?
Right.
I think that's the huge difference, because most people, once they hear that word, that you did something racist, it becomes them separating.
They shut down.
They shut down. And so, like one of the best ways I ever heard a phrase, you know, and we spoke about her a little bit earlier, Jessie Bouclier from the West Hartford Chamber. She goes, she almost does it comically. She goes, "Oh no, I did a racism," right? in having conversations with her white colleagues to say, "Hey, you know what? you're not a bad person, and you committed a faux pas. Address that faux pas, right?
Right.
That thing that you said that you thought was well intentioned, or you thought nobody was listening, or you thought it was just a joke. Address that. Realize it's not acceptable. Realize this is where you went off the rails, and this is where it's wrong, and own it. And like giving perspective, like as a male, right? I absolutely have certain privileges in the United States that some females do not enjoy, right? Like I don't walk the streets of Hartford in fear, and that was a big thing for me, because I remember moving here and my colleagues flipping out because I would walk through Hartford at night on my way to and from grad school, and they're like, it's so dangerous and bad things will happen to you. I'm like, come on, man, I'm from Brooklyn, and like I would be completely dismissive of their fear. And it took years later for me to really sit down and go, that's your lens for the universe as a 6'1", bald-headed black guy from Brooklyn with martial arts training, right? If you're a 5-foot, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman walking through Hartford in the middle of the night, it's a completely different experience, right? And my lived experience does not erase your reality.
There it is. I just have to interject right there. Like that was part of what I was saying a few moments ago. Deanna, I know you've got your hand up. So we're gonna get to you right now, but I just want to focus on that for just 1 second. Like that's one of the most important facets, is to be looking at one another and thinking about what their lived experience is, and not saying just because I didn't experience it myself that it's not someone else's reality, and really being mindful of that as we're engaging with one another. Because as Chris said, he's on the opposite side of that as a black man, right? He knows and he understands that he has certain privileges. And so we need to just be thinking about that in the context of how we engage with one another. Deanna, you had your hand up.
So I really don't know if this is where you wanted the conversation to go, but in with what they were discussing, I had an example from
Sure.
my life, and I didn't know if that's kind of where this was shared experience, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so being very open. So I
Mhm.
grew up here in Newington, and I'm a millennial. And I went to kindergarten in 1989 to 1990. And most of the children at that point were white children, especially in like year one class. There's 25, 26 kids, and the teacher's white, and all the teachers are white. And all your neighbors are white. And we had a few kids bust in from Hartford. And as a young child, I was 4 and 5 years old in kindergarten. I thought that white people lived in Newington and Black people lived in Hartford.
Sure.
And that's just something that, like she's saying, racism, that's just, you're a kid. It's
Yeah.
And now 30 years later, the children in Newington, just to put it back right into our community, I believe people of color represent 60% of the students, if I'm not correct. And our education system is still, the administration and everything is still at what, 0.6%, I think. So has that representation changed? Are those things that I experienced still happening?
Yeah. I will tell you that, my daughter has gone through the since middle school. We moved to Newington when she was in middle school. And she just graduated this past June. And she had only, through her entire experience, only had one teacher of color through her entire experience. And that includes, again, teachers, administration, etc. So I think as much as perhaps the town has become more integrated, if you will, and more welcoming to different cultures, there are still barriers to getting to that next level, to understanding. I think it feels like the value of diversity, right? When we think about diversity and not just representation, meaning Black and brown and Asian and indigenous and so forth, people being in positions, but even more so, diversity of thought, understanding the value that diversity brings to the experience, the richness that diversity brings to our lives, from not only just lived experience, but how we look at the world, how we look at different problems that we have challenges with that we're trying to face, and the value of how somebody, say for myself, right? Somebody who grew up in Middletown in the projects, but yet was able to go on to an academic institution like Quinnipiac, right? And move through those spheres, what that lens of perspective has been, or that of Chris or Mr. King, or and really anyone on this panel. And then the same way with all of the minorities that are on this call, right? Certainly, what's the value of coming together and sharing those experiences, sharing the thoughts and perspectives, and each being equal in value to conversations, to organizations, to communities.
Well,
Jill, it
and
looks like you have something to
no,
add.
and to that end, like trying to be responsible for taking that message forward, even when you don't know. So, and Chris and I have had conversations about. So my nephews are 9 and 5, and they're young white men, right? And they live in Suffield, Connecticut, which, from what I can tell, being an outsider of Suffield, is a very white community. I mean, my sister-in-law said the only Black family she knows drives like a Tesla. She goes, I don't think that's the average Black family. I was like, I don't think that's the average any family. But I don't fault my brother and his wife for wanting the kids to go to a safe school system, with great education and opportunity. You would never fault anybody for that, because they're trying to give their children the best that they can offer. With that being said, my wife and I live in Springfield, very diverse. And so when we're here and we walk around our neighborhood, we just act the way we normally do, which is we say hi to everybody, we talk to everybody. And the boys are like, whoa, because they're not used to that. Like in Suffield, you just walk on the sidewalk and you don't talk to anybody. And, and here it's like we talk to everybody. We brought the boys to Pride. We explained what the rainbow flag meant. I mean, they're 5 and 9, but we had a conversation about, that with a 9-year-old that, you have white skin and you are a boy. And those two things mean that you are going to have a chance at some things that other people might not have. And you need to be aware of that. And we'll talk more as you continue to get older. But it's like trying to have those conversations, even though they're awkward and hard, and even when you don't have like the playbook, because I keep asking Chris for the playbook and he won't give it to me.
I'm flying the plane and changing oil at the same time. So.
Absolutely. But yeah, and I think that's the key though, right? Is getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable and knowing that these conversations have to occur. But I think, Jill, you hit on a really key point, which is the intentionality, right? And saying, it is important for us to understand, for the generations that are coming forth, that we now understand better, right? What the experience has been for non-whites in this country. Everything is kind of, as I often say, right up under our nose now. After the killing of George Floyd, and then the ongoing with Breonna Taylor, the continued conversations about racial inequity in society overall have brought it front and center, and not just in Connecticut and our communities, and not even just in the United States, but on a global perspective now. People are talking and championing change. And so what that takes is for us to have that bravery, right? And that's why the second iteration of this conversation is really moving from bravery to safe space, and why that's important. But as it relates to this conversation, it's like, how do we, right? How do we broach those topics? What is that playbook, as Jill mentioned? I don't necessarily have a playbook, but I do have some core tenets that I encourage the organizations that I support. And I'll go ahead and I'll share those. But before I get there, I know Mr. King just came off of mute. I had mentioned Mr. King before you got off earlier. I believe that you attend my church. Are you a member of the choir at Crossroads?
Yikes. See, I try to keep things undercover. Yeah, so I'm on the choir, on the worship team, and on a various number of other things. It's just when people all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, is that guy? Like I just got stopped today in the supermarket and someone said, "I'm sorry, sir. Are you the first Black town councilman in South Windsor?" And I was like, "Dang it. Yes, that's me. And you're white. Get out of my way."
Oh
But
my
no.
goodness.
All I wanted to do
Um,
was buy soap.
yeah. So, and then, even when but it is what it is. So thank you. Yeah. We're gonna get together later on. Exactly. But so the reason I came off mute is I think that at a certain point, and I'm glad to see my man on here because I think that at a certain point that, especially in regards to white males, and this is something I'm probably going to be fighting through, especially as I look to get reelected in the town of South Windsor, is that at a certain point there needs to be a separation of who is the individual as opposed to the color of their skin. I mean, what do you really care about? Do you care about the business community? Seriously? Do you care about the town community? I have children, you have grandchildren. You're so quick to show pictures of your great grandchildren, your grandchildren, But what if I was to, see one of your grandchildren or children, and I'm saying this in general, and it'll be part of my campaign a little bit, and if I was to smack them just because I felt like it? That's how, unfortunately, children of Black and brown people have to educate their children in regards to doing the right thing or not right thing in regards to the people that they're around. And I know that's not something that we touched upon. However, the reason I bring it up is this. As I was sharing with somebody earlier today, when you live a certain experience, then you can appreciate that experience even though you haven't lived it personally.
Right.
Case in point. So my wife has a niece that passed away from a drug overdose years ago, 2 years ago. I didn't appreciate it because I've never had that. And most people don't say, well, why does she do drugs? Do the crime, do the time, that type of thing. But it's not until you go through that. And what used to bother me was every holiday, why can't we just celebrate? She's in heaven now. Why can't we just celebrate the holiday? And it was because of that experience that they had, that they just can't live life as if. And what I feel, yes, and what I feel to a certain extent is, especially when we're talking about, if we're talking about race, religion, relationships, and how can we move forward, is when someone says, I have a friend that has been in this situation, and that's not funny. I have a sister who's hearing impaired. So when someone says, can you understand what's coming out of my mouth? That's not funny to me.
Right.
And so I say in that moment, that's not funny.
Right.
But more importantly, and there's a lot of people in the West Hartford Chamber that I feel this way about. And there are some that I don't even mess with. If you can treat me the same way that you do in the chamber when you're around your people, then you good with me. But if you're in the chamber and you're like, yo, Steve, you my man, I love you, Steve, I can't make this, that. And then all of a sudden I see you in a different context. You don't know why I'm there. You don't know that I'm part of the group that you paid to see. But I say, hey, what's going on? Now I'm just using jokes because she's very comfortable. And I say, hey, Jill. She's like, hey, Steven. So anyway, like I was saying, Tiffany, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Then I'm like, oh, okay. I thought we were cool. And I think it's those individuals, for me, especially white males, that say, oh, that's my man, Steve. Come here, Steve. Let me introduce you to my people. Because they know me outside of my skin tone. They respect what I do and what I bring to the table and so on and so forth. That I think that that's when we really begin to recognize not so much our differences, but, we're all in this together. At the end of the day, and I won't belabor the point, but, again, I'm just saying it because this is just timely. Tiffany, I hope you don't mind me speaking, but this is just timely from the standpoint of, the campaign that I'm about to run in South Windsor and dealing with that racial piece that I know is there and saying, you know what, at the end of the day, yeah, I see Black and white and Chinese and Indian American and so on and so forth. But when our children walk down the street, I want to know if they're acting right. And I also want to know if they're not. And I'm not going to ask you, I'm going to ask my child why they acted that way, because that's the way we all grew up. White, Black, Puerto Rican, Chinese, we all grew up with a respect in our own neighborhoods of that. And I think we've kind of lost that, especially in regards to even this political era. I mean, things, I hate to say it like this, but the hoods are off. And, you know, we're seeing it right now where, and this is not the direction you wanted to go in, Yvonne, so please don't hold it against me in church, but if there were Black people that ran up against the Capitol, it would have been a massacre. But the fact that it wasn't, we're actually having a congressional hearing where we got the video. You had cops that got smacked in the mouth with a bar.
With a fire hydrant. I mean,
and we're sitting there saying, well, we don't know why they really did it. We got the video. You know, and so these are all the things that, you know, I think just when we started to get to a point, because George Floyd, and let's be real, if it wasn't for the pandemic, because we lived this, the pandemic, all anybody had to do was watch TV. And a lot of white folk were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. And we're like, this happens every day. But the only thing about it is, it didn't only happen in the US, but the pandemic, it was the world. And they saw it. I mean, that was this Rodney King part 3, part 4, part 5. And the world saw it. And they were like, is this a Netflix movie? No, this is real life. So yeah, so I think once we identify, you know, and say, you know what, it's not right, period. Yeah. Then we can say, you know, let's continue to move forward. I appreciate the time. Thank you so much. I'll put my Cash App in the chat for donations.
And everybody can go to what is it on the 18th, Stephen? We're gonna do a big party. Stephen's gonna sing with his band, and we're coming out. Don't be shy.
I apologize, you guys. Jill, this is her. And this is Yvonne's show.
Support each other, all people. But on the 18th, I'll be there with the nephews dancing. I think it's the 18th, right? Evergreen Walk in the evening, eat some food, hang out, see Stephen King sing and dance. But Stephen, thank you for sharing that. And I think what I love about when I look around this screen, right, is that, and now granted, it's hard because you can only guess what somebody's racial identity is by looking at them in a little tiny box on a Zoom network, right? So, but when I look around this Zoom, or Chris Clark talked about the Minority Business Network and Colorful Conversations, when I look around that, when I see individuals that appear to look that they come from different backgrounds, that excites me, because we have to be brave enough to try it. And I've said to Chris, like, am I welcome at the Minority Business Network? And he's like, yeah, if you have something to bring, and if you want to learn, and I want to bring, and I definitely want to learn. And so that's, you know, all of us here today, even the ones that are not on video, you know, we're all here because we're brave enough to be here and to start building relationships with other human beings first, because Pink says it best, we all cry the same color tears.
Right. That's why I wanted to say that that's why I was happy to see Bob on there. Bob is a dude that, even on my social network, I'm sure he has his own clique, you know, Democrat, Republican, whatever, but he recognized who Stephen King is, and he knows that I care about him. If he were to call me right now and say, Steve, I'm in a situation, there's no question.
Right.
Because he's already proven that to me.
There's Bob.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to, you know, because not a lot of, especially white dudes, don't necessarily do that. They talk a good game, but then when they're in their own social spaces, how are they actually? And I think that's also what helps to get to the next level. It's not about, and you said this earlier, which I agree, in terms of, I don't see race. That's your out. Like, you have to. We all do. I apologize. I'm teaching my son and I'm teaching my daughter. You have to see it. Why? Because this is what we live every day. When those lights go on in the background, that's a cop pulling you over. Make sure you have everything you need.
Stephen, when somebody describes another human, right? Like, it's like we see things. Like, you know, if you go, so say you notice somebody, I'll use Mike Heppel as an example, right? I was like, oh, my couple is like really tall. Like you notice their height, or you notice that they're like Diane Rochelle. I always say she needs a booster seat because she's like really tiny, right? So you notice somebody's height. It's not offensive to notice someone's race, or it's not offensive for someone to know that I am married to a woman. Like I'm not offended by that, as long as because to me it's beautiful. Like our differences are our beauty, and I'm never going to be black, no matter how much I've tried, right, Chris? But like I'm never gonna be black. So that's it. Chris gets the joke. But my point is that we have to celebrate the differences and that beauty. Jasmine, I see you're on camera finally. Hello, my beautiful friend. Jasmine and I have talked about it. She's a West Coaster. I'm an East Coaster. We call them sneakers. They call them tennis shoes. That's weird, but that's part of the beauty of East Coast,
Yes.
West Coast difference, right, Jasmine?
Yes.
I think you
I
laid
was eating before, but I was listening to everything everyone was saying. Yeah, I agree very much. And I think that being a woman and being a person of color really works negatively in my, like, I don't want to say negatively, but it is the truth of the things that, and being young also works very negatively for me in the profession that I am in.
Mhm. And it's interesting because I've had conversations about myself being a Black woman, a fair-skinned Black woman, what that experience has been like, both within the Black community, outside of the Black community, the benefits, right? The privilege that my lighter skin has afforded me, but also the discrimination and the frustration within my own Black community of seeing me as a representation of colonialism, my light skin as a result of slavery in and of itself, and the challenges that come along with that. And I agree with you, Jasmine. When I have conversations with clients about privilege, I often say, we judge based on what we see, right? And when it comes to privilege, I do believe, and sometimes we get in the discussion of white privilege, which is often such a trigger. And I'm glad to explain that further for anybody who wants that. But in terms of privilege overall, the dynamic that I come from is the fact that we all have privilege in some form or fashion, in some forums of life. I have the privilege that I grew up in the projects, but now I live in the suburbs of Newington. I have the privilege of getting a formal education. I've had the privilege of going on to work in corporate settings and have climbed some ladders while not having enough privilege to get into other certain rooms and get to the pinnacle of my career where I probably could have. And so when we think about privilege and we think about the barriers and the constraints of privilege, as Jasmine was just mentioning, we start looking at the layers of our identity and where those barriers lie. And so it's interesting from her perspective, when we even think about generations, that she is very clearly seeing the limitations that are before her because she is a woman, because she is a woman of color, and because she is a woman of color of a certain age. So it's almost like she's got 3 strikes against her from the giddy up. And so she's going to have to overcome certain barriers that perhaps if she were white, that those barriers would not exist. And so that's part of the conversation that we have necessarily about privilege, is that, do you wake up in a form or fashion that you don't have to think about as you enter into the world? And I've had discussions with folks about that, in particular for those that identify as white. Like, do you ever think about your race? When you wake up in the morning, when you're getting ready, before you get out the door, what you dress like, what you drive, how you'll be perceived if you play your music at a certain volume as you're driving into the office. All of those factors, do you really have to think about it? And the conversations that I've had with folks, and a lot of them white, will say, absolutely not. It doesn't even occur to me. And I say, then that is a part of privilege. That is what we refer to sometimes as white privilege, as not having to think about your race in terms of your existence and what the barriers of what the barriers exist for someone else who is not white.
Yvonne,
Go ahead, Chris.
I think that's huge, right? Like I'll take it a step further and go, one of the things that I pose to my white friends is, do you ever think about your actions as being representative of your race?
Mm.
So when you do something, do you stop and go, damn it, that's a bad look for us? Or is it, damn it, that's a bad look for me? Right?
Yeah.
And that's the weight that your colleagues of color carry when they walk into, particularly in, I speaking from my experience, I work in settings where I am generally the only person of color. Particularly, when you start climbing up that ladder, the air gets very rare for us, right?
Yeah.
And
Agreed.
and there are times where I'm like, I'll give an example. One of my buddies, he called me with it, and he's pretty high up the food chain in his company, and this is years and years ago. But they had a welcoming dinner for a bunch of the new employees, and they laid it out banquet style, and he said, he's a white gentleman, and we're close enough where we can have this conversation. But he says, there was one black guy in the room, and they laid out the banquet, they laid out the buffet, and the gentleman is at the buffet, and he goes for fried chicken and watermelon. He says, Clark, when he picked up that food, I saw you in the background screaming, no! Because of
The stereotypes.
the stereotypical imagery. And kudos to that man for being comfortable enough in his skin to say, hey, I just feel like eating this, and to hell with whoever's watching. But in my lived experience, I am very cognizant of, well, I would say younger me was very cognizant of those things. Yeah, I am now in a place where I am comfortable enough in my own skin that I'm going to eat whatever the hell I want, right? But it has to be something that enters your mind when you're a person of color. It's like, oh man, am I doing the stereotypically the stereotypical thing, right? Whereas, my white colleagues and friends, that never enters their mind. Or, even taking it a step further, remembering, like one of my friends asked the question, at what age were you cognizant of being black? And I said, I don't ever remember not knowing that I was black, right? And not knowing that black was something, for all intents and purposes, other within this country, right? Like I wake up every morning and I'm a black man in America, whereas some of my friends and colleagues is just like, I'm a man. It's a very different lived experience.
Right. And I think that reality is something that we all have to come to terms with. And the beauty of this moment, it feels like, and when I say this moment, I think this era that we're in, is that we're having these conversations, right? Because generations ago, they didn't necessarily talk about this, right? You had a lot of conversation around the civil rights era, and that work was done, and we thought we were on our way. And then we've had other experience. We've had, different people in different positions. I don't want to get into politics, but, we had some dynamics happening in our society that brought race to the forefront in a really, I'll say interesting way. But I just want to circle us back to this discussion around generations, because I know that, for example, Michelle, I don't know if you want to come off of mute, but I know we've talked a little bit about generational dynamics within families. How do you have those conversations with, perhaps, as I had up on the screen a little while ago, that family member that might say some things that are, we will say, racially insensitive, or they don't quite understand what's going on in the world, the changes, why we're having the discussions we're having, and they say things that some of us might find offensive. And so, Michelle, I don't know if you want to say anything to that before I get into sharing a couple of tips.
Generation, my daughter, they get very upset if they hear anything off color. They just like snap. And then I know we were talking about even younger generations, and how when someone spoke about their generation didn't see color. So I think as you're talking about generations, you're talking about, you know, the traditional generation grew up in Hartford, and, you know, just to, you know, not be in politically correct, maybe, you know, well, the cats lived over here, the dogs lived over here, the you know, and they just, it didn't matter if it was a nationality or a race. It was, and kind of like what Deanna was talking about, you know, when we grew up in Newington, and I'm much older than her, and it was the same thing. We weren't trying to be racist. It was just like we were saying before, someone is tall or someone is short. It was just a description, not necessarily hurting anyone's feelings. But our kids don't see that. They just get so upset when they hear, you know, someone talking out like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think, you know, I'd like to share a couple of slides. There's something that I put together in terms of really kind of leaning in to the uncomfortable conversations, right? So whether that's with, again, with a friend or a family member or a coworker, how do you bridge that conversation? How do you begin? How do you withstand their perspective when it rubs up against your own? And how do you have that conversation without it resulting necessarily in conflict, right? But more so it results in, hopefully, a meeting of the minds, or, you know, and maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, an expansion of the mind, an expansion both of the mind and heart for other people's experiences, and to really drive through empathy, which is really the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. And that's really key for this. So let me just go ahead and me. All right, can everybody see my screen? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So leaning into uncomfortable conversations is not easy to do. So one of the things that I recommend to folks is to lead with shared values, right? Focus on the thing that you have in common. If you have to have a conversation where there's a disconnect in that commonality, start with what you have in common most. So for an example, I put this up on the screen. When there's a lot of uh, conversation right now about the American dream, right? Who has access to it? Who has the opportunity to bring their whole selves to both community or workplaces? Focusing more on the shared values that we have, perhaps even as Americans, can help to really focus an individual and start to get them into that mindset. And then using those values to bridge the racial divide, right? And so when we talk about things like, example, our country, when we talk about different racial experiences, again, focusing it back on the values. So it's not necessarily attacking the other person's ideology or perspective, but again, just really kind of knitting together what we see in common. And that can be a fantastic way to lead into a conversation about the difference in our perspectives once we've established some commonality with them, rather than leading with those differences. And then really getting curious and being genuine about it. I have seen people interact and immediately go to this dynamic of, you know, I don't know where you got that perspective. That's so archaic. People don't think that way anymore. More so than attacking the individual's perspective, get curious about it. Ask the questions. Well, you know what? I'm just curious. Why do you think that way, right? When we get into conversations, let's just say, for an example, about the bootstraps, right? We brought that up earlier. Well, you know, you have this person who says, well, if Black people would just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, they could have the same level of success that I have, right? Getting curious about it rather than attacking that and saying, well, you know, why do you think that? What is it that you've had in your experience that makes you think that that's valid? And kind of unwinding that a little bit can really help the other individual to perhaps recognize that that may be something that they were taught, something that was said in the upbringing, something that's said within their communities, but doesn't really have a lot of validity to it. And then you start to open up and kind of dissect a little bit that thinking. But when you do that, it's really important to be genuine with that, right? Not saying it as if like it being a poke to them, like, really? So tell me, sarcastically, why do you think that? Like, where did that come from? Like, that's not going to help to bridge the divide that's between that person and yourself, but to be genuine about the curiosity that you have. And then being willing to think more broadly, even yourself, as you enter into the conversation, to understand that people have certain perspectives and notions and ideologies that oftentimes have been built over time, over generations. It's deep seated. And so it's not something that can be easily unearthed, unlearned, and easily replaced. I think, as Jill had mentioned, it's this constant evolution of learning. So we ourselves, for those of us that may consider ourselves woke, definitely need to be thinking more broadly about the history for a particular individual. As Deanna had mentioned as well, like growing up in a certain environment, if that's all you saw, if that's all you were ever exposed to, then you're only going to have that perspective. It doesn't make you a bad, horrible person. It doesn't make you necessarily a racist. What it does is it makes you have only a certain lived experience that didn't get exposure to other cultures, to other communities. And so your perspective is very narrow. And so, can we allow some latitude for that with one another to be able to say, like, oh, wow, that's why this individual has that perspective. So, even for those of us who understand it more, and are championing more diversity, equity, and inclusion, and having those conversations with different generations, is for us to even think more broadly about the genesis of that perspective and helping to educate one another as we start to expand our thinking. And then the dynamic of say less, think more, right? I think oftentimes when we think about the perspective of active listening, right? And that's where we're fully engaged, we're not on our phones, we're making direct eye contact, and we're fully invested in the conversation we're having with an individual, rather than formulating, getting ready any moment to fire off our response. Well, we're not really listening, right? And so the dynamic of say less, think more. Think critically about the person's perspective before you just react to it emotionally. And again, that kind of goes back to that thinking more broadly. You don't necessarily have to have a retort or an answer in that conversation. You can come with some takeaways, perhaps even do some research, have some additional conversations, and then go back to it. I think that's really important, especially with family members, right? You don't want these conversations to get so hot and heavy to the point that it causes a disruption or a schism in the family dynamic. So, kind of stepping away when those things get heated, be very thoughtful about the best way to approach that individual, what their history has been, what their own lived experience has been that's colored their perspective for the perspective that they have. And then definitely meeting them where they are. Everybody is at a different point in this journey, right? Like, I hear Jill, and she's so incredibly tapped in and is so confident in where she stands and where she needs to go, that she has no problem saying, I have some racist ideologies, or I've had some experiences, but I am working very diligently to become more understanding, to become more inclusive. And that's beautiful, but not everybody is there. So, can we meet people where they are and meet them with that empathy to help understand how they got to the place where they are, and to walk alongside them on the journey, not necessarily berating them or judging them, but really this dynamic of almost, am I my brother's keeper? And what does that mean? And can we walk together in a society to help one another to learn? Going back to what Chris said, or someone had indicated, oh, I think it was actually Jill, those people who have been marginalized and oppressed, it's not their responsibility to educate us, but to educate oneself and come back and to have those conversations so we can really bridge that racial divide, regardless of generations, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. Can we start to have those real conversations so that we can build bridges between one another rather than having this incredible divide that we have now, excuse me, within our society. And so that's the goal. That's the important takeaways in terms of how do we have these conversations. And so I would love to hear maybe from Melissa or Leslie or Deborah about your own experience and the challenges that you're having and how we can help, even within the context of this conversation, to help equip you better.
Hi, I'm Melissa.
Melissa.
I'm from Mind, Body, and Soul. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I practice in Wethersfield. Just a bit about me. This is very interesting. One thing that I keep thinking about lately is I have an 11-year-old son, and I'm trying super, super hard to raise a very kind, not toxically masculine, open-minded young man. And I think I'm doing pretty good. But it's tough. Let me tell you, it's tough to navigate this as a mother, as a therapist. I have so much experience. I'm thinking of all these stories that I've had, and over the years, all the things I've been through. I started my career at the Children's Home of Cromwell 17 years ago. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. That's back when we had more of a juvenile parole. So I worked with a bunch of different kids, and that's where really racially I had to look within myself and really. Yeah, there are some racist things that I was raised with and I was confronted with, and really had to work through that. And with a lot of different families and a lot of different kids, learned a lot about Black girls and their hair, and fought really hard. I mean, I'm honestly, like, I remember being in meetings at the school and fighting, like, if you're not going to give me money to get her hair braided, you need to let her wear her scarf. I didn't know any of that. I was 24 years old. So with all that, I have a lot of now I got my 15-year-old is dating a Chinese American young man. So, lately I've been on the Asian hate. So I'm kind of I'm all in here with you guys, because I feel like I'm going through a lot of this, but I really am trying hard to teach my son, like, you do have more than my daughter and I, because we're women. So white privilege. I feel it. No, I don't think about my race when I leave. I think about my gender a lot more. I'm a single mother. I'm, trying to raise this kid and trying to teach him, like, there's going to be like some things that are going to happen for you that might not happen for your sister or me, or for your, your friend down the road. We live in Berlin, which is a predominantly white town, which is not something that I wanted, but my ex-husband did. So one of the reasons why we're divorced. It's not very diverse, which bothers me. I grew up in Newington, graduated in 1996, so not too diverse. But any advice, like, how do I navigate this with him, and then also the boys that I work with, because I do work with a wide variety of adolescents and college age kids.
Can I chime in on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Go for it.
So I'll provide the lens. In addition to my day job and the stuff I do on these kinds of calls, I also am part of a podcast for single fathers, right? And I say, first thing that I commend you for is you own your perspective, right? You own that, hey, I grew up hearing certain things, and they don't, based on my experience, those things that I heard and that I grew up with no longer jive with my thinking, right? And I am a firm believer that ignorance has a hard time existing in the presence of evidence, right? And one of the best teachers that you can provide for your kids is experience, right? So one of the things that I often run into is people have these very firm beliefs, right? And you go, where do these beliefs come from? Oh, you know, my mom told me or my dad told me. And as human beings, you know, look at social media. Social media is the global, like the global example of this, where people believe word of mouth a lot more quickly than they believe, you know, scientific data and true evidence. They have to go out and, you know, because they trust the people who give them that data, and then they go out and they live in the world and they get exposure to people who are not like them, and they go, well, that's not right. That doesn't seem accurate. You know what I and that's where you see that schism, right? And so when we look at millennials and we look at, you know, Gen Z, what's the big difference? They have the internet, right? And whereas a lot of us, you know, in Gen X and previous generations, we use the internet as an echo chamber. These kids are using the internet in the way that it was meant to be, to gain experiences and gain exposure to people that they normally wouldn't have access to if they're using it right, which, you know, most of them do. And so, you know, I look at my kids and they have friends all over the world of all different sexual orientations and races and you know, that has helped shape their perspective. So with your son, you know, number one, have the frank conversations with him, you know, and say, hey, buddy, like you're living in a skin that is very different than, you know, or you're living in an existence that's going to be very different than mine and your sister's, and very different from a lot of your friends. And in the same way, like in my lived experience, I become cognizant of my privilege, and I go, you know, if I'm in a situation where my privilege can benefit other people, that's my mentality. And what you can do with your son is program him for that as well, and say, hey, you know what? There are going to be a lot of times and spaces where you are going to have a leg up to on the people who are around you, or you're going to have a platform that the people around you will not have. Use that platform for good, or use that platform to the benefit of others who don't have that voice.
Yeah. Something I often say to organizations that I support is the whole goal of this is to use your privilege and access to provide privilege and access for those who don't have privilege and access. That's it. Like that's the whole thing right there. No matter what that privilege and access is for everybody who's on this call, for everybody walking the earth, right? It's almost I can hear in the background Louis Armstrong, oh, what a wonderful world it would be. But literally, this is what it takes. So I agree with what Chris said. I would say continue to expose your children to different cultures and different environments so that that starts to inform the lens of their perspective as it is for different races. Same things with parents and other family members. If we have those who perhaps have some ideas and perspectives, right, that are rooted in some forms of racism, regardless of what you tell them, you may not be able to change their minds. But if you start to expose them to the thing that is the subject of their bias, and they start to see that it's not what they thought it was, and they have a different experience, that can be a very powerful motivator to changing that lens of perspective. So I would say, piggybacking on what Chris said, I think the exposure element can be incredibly powerful, whether that's through reading, whether that's through movies, if it's exposure to different foods, going to different restaurants, right? And exposing them to the things to make sure that they get that lens of perspective of really like, wow, the world is global. And I want to be part of a global community. And I don't want to be afraid. And I don't want to have my bias kick in and, you know, cause me to lean to what I know, but I want to have that full blown exposure. Even if you don't live in an area where there is a lot of diversity, you can still choose to expose yourself and expose your family to those things so that they have those broader experiences.
Which I think is really important. Like, and this TikTok drives me bananas sometimes, but I think, Chris, to your point, like, because just get off, right? But for other reasons, like it is exposing them to all different kinds of cultures and things that they're not getting here in Berlin. And I also try to point out, and I try to teach this to my clients, we were in DC on a family trip and we went to a McDonald's and we're the only white people. And they looked at me and I said, I want you to take a minute and remember this feeling, because this is how all of your Black and Indian and Chinese friends in Berlin feel. How you feel right now, this is exactly how they feel. And I only wish they had a few more experiences like that. So I try to point it out when it, right? Because I'm like, this is good for you to feel this way.
Yeah.
I've always worked in, nonprofits and with all kinds of people. I've worked outside of Berlin. I worked in West Hartford. So they're a little sheltered, but I was glad that they had that experience.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So the more that we do that, the better we will all be. And I would say the same thing for people of color, right? Who grow up in predominantly, Black environments. I myself did that, right? And when I went to Quinnipiac, I had complete culture shock and I felt horribly small and I didn't know how to deal. I really didn't. I remember going back to my father and saying, like, I can't go here. Like, there's nobody that looks like me. I'm the only one in my classes, etc. And my father said, you're looking at that time. I was looking to go into law. And he said, what do you think the law firms are going to be like?
Right.
You might as well get that schooling right now and learn how to navigate those waters, because you're going to be in those waters for a long time, girlfriend. And so it was like, okay, so we as well as a culture and as a community need to learn how to navigate around people of different cultures, and that discomfort, figuring out what is the root of that discomfort, and then how do I expose myself to the thing so that I can get more comfortable. So to your point, Melissa, hopefully the more that you expose them to that, they will be in that environment and you won't even have to say it, right? They'll automatically get to this point of like, wow, now I know what this feels like. And I take that experience and that perspective back into my community. And then I become more of a champion for diversity and inclusion, because now I understand at least a modicum of what that experience feels like.
Call it keeping your head on a swivel.
Yes.
If you know where you're at, I graduated from Penn State, born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, started in Altoona, which is white as white can be, and then made a transition, and I went to a private Christian school, where they busted Black kids in. So I had kind of both sides, but then when I went to Penn State and I was around all the Black kids, I didn't grow up around weed. I didn't grow up around drinking. Not only were my parents Christians, but I lived in the suburbs at a certain point. And so all of that, like I remember the bully, the Black gang member bully, who I was scared of in high school. When I eventually said I'm going to Penn State, and the town, the block found out, all of a sudden the bully was like, yo, he's getting out. He's untouchable. He's getting out. And I say that even as I have conversations with my Black son about the reality of this world, I'm still very conscious of when he's around his white friends. And so I congratulate you as well, that I encourage them to come over to Mr. King's house.
Exposure.
Smell these. What's funny? I remember going to a homecoming dance with my friend Rob, who was African-American, really cute kid, whatever. We couldn't dance. I was a little disappointed, but like it was like a big freaking deal. I'm like, what is the big deal? Like I remember my grandparents, like I was like, I drive him to school every day. He lives down the road. We weren't together. We were friends. Like we were truly friends. But I remember that generational thing and like looking at my Italian grandparents and being like, what is wrong with you people? Like he's a good kid. Like, and he was a better kid than me. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He didn't do anything. He played football. I was like, I was probably worse than, Yeah. But you know what Rob said? I will never forget this moment for the rest of my life. He got drunk. Okay. So maybe there was a little bit of that going on after. I was not drunk. He fell. And I said, Rob, you got to get up. He said, Melissa, help me get up, or else they're going to beat me like they beat Rodney King. And I said, Rob, what are you talking about? And I was like, in that moment, I'm like, oh my God. Like his life, even though he lives down the road from me and I pick him up for school, he lives with his grandmother, is so different than mine. And it like shook me to the core. And it's like, you have those moments in your life and I never forgot it. I never will. I don't really know what happened to Rob. He probably did very well. He did well in school, but because he was impaired, right? His guard was down. It was just me and him. And I had my, I'm like, get up. We're in Indian Hill golf course, right? Not supposed to be
Wow.
there. Oh God, this is being taped. Well, this was a long time ago. Don't I have like,
statute of limitations, you should be good.
but I remember
Yeah,
like
you've got
thinking
immunity. You're
like,
fine.
Rob, I was like, oh my God. What are you
Change my
talking
name
about?
right now. Change my name.
So can I tell you how incredibly important that is, right?
Yeah.
You just touched on something that's really important.
Right?
And I'm saying this as a black guy, and not speaking for every black person, but share that moment you had with Rob. That is generally a formative moment
Real.
for a lot of my white friends, because you think about it, it's not your lived experience, and it goes back to what I was saying about the apathy, right? And the apathy isn't necessarily a malicious thing. It's you don't see it, you don't live it, you don't know about it. So until you have that conversation with your friends of color, you don't know that it's going on. Because you have the privilege of
Right.
turning a blind eye to it. And so, like one of the experiences, I was leading a conversation for my workplace. I head up the Black professional group for my company, and on the tail of George Floyd, we started having courageous conversations within the company, and so I'm leading this national call, and my partner at work, who I've known for 6 years, and it has been a great mentor to tons of people of color. I had him on the call as well, and we were talking about police interactions, and we were having the conversation. I said, explaining what George Floyd went through, and stop and frisk, and the idea that not police interactions a lot of time are not favorable for people of color, and a lot of times it's not something that they did. I said, hell, even I have those experiences. And he stopped these. Wait, what, you? I said, yeah. And I laid out, like my family's police pedigree and the fact that I worked for the New York Police Foundation, and I was a poster boy for a NYPD ad, a public service announcement about courtesy, professionalism, and respect. And that ad was in every precinct in New York during the late 90s. And if you walk into some precincts, it's still there on billboards all over New York. And it was still not enough to stop me from being harassed by the police. And he damn near cried when I shared that with him. And because he just didn't know. Because, from his perspective as a white man, police are civil servants. They're there to serve and protect. And they are there, they work at my pleasure. So I can stand there and get in a shouting match with a police officer and not have to fear for my life. Or if I get stopped by a police officer, I can be indignant. Right? That's his lens. And to hear my lens and my perspective was eye-opening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. I know we're over time. We were supposed to kind of end at 8 o'clock. I know that Deborah, we didn't hear from you. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add, or you were just listening and kind of taking it all in. But I do want to let us go ahead and close out with any last thoughts. And if anybody's interested in kind of the tips that I gave, I'm glad to share that out as well. Tiffany, you have a question.
No, I just wanted, since you're ending with last thoughts, I just wanted to say thank you. I have been mostly since George Floyd was murdered, how I guess is the better way to say it. I've really become more curious about kind of going back to Jill said, kind of what was instilled in me unknowingly, and what Deanna said. And I started watching uncomfortable conversations with the Black man. I know you and I have spoken about that. But this forum is, and I've talked to Chris Clark, and I've obviously talked to you, Yvonne, but this forum, I think, needs to happen on a more regular basis, because I have I have taken away so much of it. Just from where I sit in this world and where I came from and raising a young white man. And that needs to be talked about more. You know, I think exposing our kids is wonderful, but I think it's also exposing ourselves because Yvonne, I think you said Jill said, people are watching us and our kids watch us. So I think if we start with us, our friends watch us, our family watches, you know, everybody kind of looks and goes off what we say and do. Just like, you know, from my example, my grandfather fought in World War II, and there were some Asians that lived across the street, and I grew up with him remembering being little, and he was throwing rocks at them, and I didn't know why. I remember I thought it was because of their dogs. I had no clue. And then I didn't realize until I took a class in college and it put it together in my head. Like, oh my God, that's why my grandfather was doing that. It wasn't for the dogs. So I think it's having those conversations with our kids and exposing them, but it's also, and having them be open, which I think their generation is a lot more open. But I think this conversation shouldn't end here. I think it should continue.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.
No,
This was
you're
great.
absolutely welcome. Deborah, last thoughts?
I just wanted to, say that I belong to the Wethersfield Chamber, and Tiffany asked me to share this night with on my social media page, and so I took the opportunity to jump on and see what it was all about. And I thought it was great, Yvonne. I thought what your work is awesome, and the honesty that was said on this call, I admire. I think it's great. So our town right now, has a very large group of people who are doing a social justice committee, and so there's a lot of work being done. And I think that the personally, I think that the prejudice go far beyond what we even talked about. There's, every day you run into it. So yeah, but you know what? We're getting there. I believe that with my whole heart. We're getting there. We're talking about it. And wasn't like that even 4 years ago. So
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So kudos to everybody who's on the call, and I thank you for inviting me and letting me join in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us. And just to tease out where we're headed. So in September, we're going to have another conversation entitled Moving from Bravery to Safe Space. When we think about first responders before they rush into a burning building or make some heroic attempt to help others to safety, they must muster up a critical attribute, right? Which is bravery. And so the same logic really applies to us before we can have challenging conversations about DEI within the workplace, family, friends. We really need to have the courage to do so. So we're going to have a little bit of conversation around that and just help to guide us, to challenge us to have a stronger voice and more courageous conversations like this one. And then in October, we're going to highlight hidden figures to the forefront, a discussion on sexual orientation, gender identity across age and ethnicity. So that's going to be another conversation. To your point, Deborah, there's so many different areas that we need to address that fall under this umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm really excited that the Newington Chamber of Commerce, as well as the library, are willing to put time forth to have these conversations and to expose us more, so that we can hopefully get on the same page with one another more. And so thank you for everyone's time. Michelle, I don't know if you have any closeout comments before we
Yes, I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank Chris. I'm so pleased, so happy. So many people were able to join us. I can't wait to kick it up to the next notch. And I can say that if you get the Newington Life, you'll see that Yvonne was interviewed by Mark Janey, and she's even going to be on the cover. So I'm so proud. that I was able to just, one women's networking group, and look what happened. So I think we have a long way to go. I'm so happy where we are. I'm glad. I think our kids sometimes are more advanced than us, and hope that the generation they raise will, like you said, be so diverse, and life is good. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming. And you know where to reach me at the library if anybody has any other questions for Yvonne. I'm sure many of us have her number, but I can hook you up. And thank you so much. And I look forward to working with all of you again. So have a great night, and thanks for coming.